Here are 3 terrifying hotel encounters. Story 1: The room at the end. It was a hot summer evening when I found myself driving through an endless stretch of highway. My eyes grew heavy, and I knew I had to find a place to rest. Spotting a small, flickering neon sign that read motel, I decided to pull over. The motel was isolated, with a few cars scattered in the parking lot. The building looked aged but maintained. Inside, the receptionist, an elderly woman with a strained smile, greeted me. Her eyes seemed tired, as if she hadn't slept in days. She handed me a rusty key labeled 108, the room at the far end of the complex. "Enjoy your stay," she said, her voice almost a whisper. As I walked down the dimly lit hallway, I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. The room was basic but clean. I threw my bag on the bed and took a quick shower, hoping to wash away the fatigue. As I toweled off, I noticed the bathroom mirror was slightly fogged, but there were words scrawled in the steam. They were faint, almost indecipherable, but it looked like leave. I chalked it up to my tired mind playing tricks on me. I lay on the bed and flipped through the TV channels, eventually settling on an old black and white movie. The volume was low, and soon I found myself drifting off to sleep. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of whispers. First, I thought it was the TV, but it was off. The whispers seemed to come from the walls, soft but persistent. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make sense of the sounds. It was a mixture of voices, too many to count, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. My heart raced, but I tried to convince myself it was just the pipes or an old heating system. I got back into bed, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic. I grabbed the phone to call the front desk, but there was no dial tone. The line was dead. Panic set in as the whispers turned into knocks, soft at first, then louder and more insistent. I covered my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it seemed to seep into my very being. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the feeling of someone watching me. I tried to move, but my body felt paralyzed. In the darkness, I could just make out a figure sitting at the edge of my bed. It was a shadowy silhouette, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The air grew thick, and a sense of dread washed over me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure slowly leaned closer, and I could feel its cold breath on my face. Just as I thought I would suffocate from fear, I managed to break free from my paralysis. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my bag, and fled the room. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I drove to the next town, too terrified to look back. I parked at a busy gas station and spent the rest of the night in my car, lights on and doors locked. The next morning, I called the motel to report the incident. The woman who answered sounded confused. She told me that room 108 had been closed off for years after a series of strange occurrences and that no one should have been given the key. When I described the receptionist who checked me in, the woman on the phone went silent. "That sounds like Mrs. Hopkins," she said slowly, "but she passed away 5 years ago." Story 2: The Vanishing Guest. It was a chilly autumn night when I arrived at a small, nondescript motel just off the highway. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it to my next business meeting, but exhaustion forced me to stop. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the building looked like it had seen better days. The clerk at the front desk barely glanced up from his magazine as he handed me the key to room 210 on the second floor. The stairway creaked with every step, and the dim lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls. As I reached the second floor, I noticed a woman standing by the window at the end of the hallway. She was dressed in outdated clothes, her eyes fixed on something outside. Her presence was unsettling, but I shrugged it off and continued to my room. The room was small and sparsely furnished, but it was warm, and that was all I cared about. I unpacked my suitcase and decided to get a soda from the vending machine downstairs. As I passed the woman again, I felt a chill run down my spine. She hadn't moved an inch. I gave her a polite nod, but she didn't acknowledge me. Back in my room, I tried to relax, but a feeling of unease lingered. I chalked it up to the long drive and the creepy hallway. I watched TV for a while before finally deciding to get some sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my door. It was a soft, persistent knock. Through the peephole, I saw the woman from the hallway. She was crying, her eyes red and puffy, and she was mouthing something, but I couldn't make out the words. I hesitated, unsure whether to open the door. Eventually, I cracked it open, but she was gone. The hallway was empty, and the silence was deafening. I stepped out, looking both ways, but there was no sign of her. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I closed the door and locked it tightly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I lay back in bed, my mind racing. The knocking started again, this time louder and more frantic. I jumped up and yanked the door open, but again, no one was there. I decided to go to the front desk and report the incident, but when I got there, the clerk was nowhere to be found. The lobby was eerily quiet, and a sense of dread began to overwhelm me. I went back to my room, feeling more anxious by the minute. As I lay in bed, trying to calm myself, I heard the soft sound of crying. It was coming from the corner of my room. I turned on the light, but nothing was there. The crying grew louder, more desperate. I covered my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. The next morning, I checked out as soon as the sun rose. I mentioned the woman to the morning clerk, who looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "You're not the first to see her," he said quietly. He explained that years ago, a woman had stayed in room 210 with her daughter. The daughter disappeared one night, and the woman was found wandering the halls, searching for her lost child. She eventually took her own life in that very room. Since then, guests have reported seeing her ghost, always standing by the window, staring out as if searching for her daughter. I left the motel, vowing never to return. The image of the crying woman haunted me for weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that her spirit was still trapped, endlessly searching for her lost child. Story 3: The Locked Door. It was a stormy night when I pulled into a decrepit motel just off the interstate. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind howled through the broken sign that flickered intermittently. Desperate for shelter, I parked my car and dashed inside. The lobby was dimly lit and smelled of mildew. The young man behind the counter seemed jumpy, his eyes darting around nervously. He handed me the key to room 312 without making eye contact. "Enjoy your stay," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. As I walked down the corridor, the flickering lights and peeling wallpaper added to the unsettling atmosphere. As I approached my room, I noticed the door to 311 was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed it open. Inside, I was surprised to see a heavy padlock on the inside of the door, as if someone had locked themselves in. The room was dark and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickly closed the door and entered my own room. It was small and sparsely furnished, with a musty smell that made me wrinkle my nose. I tried to ignore the oddity next door and settled in for the night. The storm outside was relentless, and the power kept flickering. Around midnight, I heard a loud thud from room 311. I knocked on the door but got no response. The sound repeated, followed by what sounded like muffled cries. I decided to report it to the front desk, but when I got there, the receptionist was gone. The lobby was eerily quiet, and I felt a growing sense of unease. Back in my room, the noises from next door continued. The cries turned into whispers, unintelligible but desperate. I tried to block it out, but the sound seemed to penetrate through the walls. My heart pounded as I realized I wasn't alone. The next morning, I mustered the courage to peek into room 311 again. Inside, the room was in shambles, like someone had left in a hurry. On the floor was an old photograph of a family, with one face scratched out. I quickly shut the door and went to the front desk to check out. The morning clerk seemed more forthcoming. He explained that room 311 had been locked and unused for years after a tragic incident involving a family. The husband had disappeared, and the wife and child were found dead under mysterious circumstances. No one had stayed there since. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cries and whispers I heard were the echoes of a family torn apart by tragedy, trapped in that room forever.